What is orthopedics? Orthopedics is the study of bone and bone diseases. Okay. So then first we'll talk about what the bone is. So bone is a mineralized, dense connective tissue. It is basically made up of very few cells in a dense mineralized matrix. It consists of more than 30 to 40% of our body weight, whole body weight. And thing which is might be surprising to you, it's very dynamic in nature, bones. So it's estimated that actually your entire skeletal system is changed once you reach 30 years of age. So every 30 years, the entire skeleton is entirely changed. So, anyways, uh, what is the function of the bones in the body? Give me some suggestions. Participate in this. Yeah, it makes the framework of the body. It provides structure to the body. Apart from that, bones help us move, joints. The bones are connected by joints, and it helps us move. So movement is a big part of the skeletal system. Apart from that, uh, it protects organs. It also participates in hematopoiesis, which is the production of the blood cells of the body, and it acts as a reservoir of minerals and fats. The components of the skeletal system are, it has two basic components, inorganic and organic components. The inorganic component is an overwhelming part, so it's 65% of the whole weight of the bones. It is formed by hydroxyapatite. Very simply put, hydroxyapatite is a crystal of calcium phosphate. So, and apart from that, the organic part consists of 35%, and it's mainly composed of type 1 collagen. Now, the function of type 1 collagen is the basic organic material in the bones, and it provides the framework for the minerals to deposit. It forms thick fibrils on which the hydroxyapatite crystals are deposited. Apart from that, it consists of proteoglycans and some non-collagenous proteins, which forms 10% of the whole organic components. The non-collagenous proteins are osteocalcin, osteopontin, and osteonectin. Now, the two most important parts of this are osteocalcin and osteonectin. Osteonectin is the protein which binds the mineral to the collagen, and osteocalcin is synthesized from the osteoblasts. And the clinical importance of this is osteocalcin is the protein which is leaked into the bloodstream, and its serum level reflects bone formation, and it also reflects the bone turnover. Do you understand what is bone turnover? What I mean by bone turnover? Like suppose, what is turnover? When a bone is being replaced continuously, whether bone is being destroyed or new bone is being formed, that reflects the bone turnover. So, osteocalcin forms it's a marker, the serum marker, which shows how much bone turnover is there. So, in which cases would you expect bone turnover to increase? Just as a common sense. In which cases would you think that there is more bone deposition? In bone tumors, very simply put, if there is a new bone tumor, there is new bone formation is there. So you would expect the osteocalcin levels to increase in blood. Just small note on the embryological origins of bone. The bone cell origins from the neural crest cell and the sclerotome, which forms the osteoblast. Now, osteoblast is the basic stem cell, you can say, of the skeletal system. The purpose is that it changes gene expression and it can convert into a chondroblast or a fibroblast. Microscopically, there are two types of bone tissues that we can study here. The primary bone or the woven bone, it's a random orientation of coarse collagen fibers. It forms a numerous large irregular shaped osteocytes per unit. It has a very high mineral density and it is rapidly growing, and it is predominantly formed in the embryonic stages and during growth. And in adults, it reappears when there is a fracture and the bone callus is being formed. And osseointegration of implant, which is not that important right now. So basically, woven bone is the first bone which is created whenever there is an injury in the bone, whether there is a fracture or a new implant has been put. It's largely a disorganized mass of bone, the woven bone. Now, without a fracture, these are a few cases you should remember, some diseases where a woven bone can reappear. This is pathological. So, it can reappear in Paget's disease, in renal osteodystrophy, in fluorosis, and in hyperparathyroidism. In all of these cases, if you see, these are basically diseases in which there is new bone formation, pathological new bone formation. It's not a fracture as such. I wouldn't, if you don't consider fracture as a pathology. Apart from these diseases are where there is new bone formation. So as I said, since a woven bone is a disorganized mass of bone, is a primary bone, whenever there is a disease in which there is new bone formation, you get a woven bone. So examples are Paget's disease, renal osteodystrophy, hyperparathyroidism, and fluorosis. What is hyperparathyroidism? Do you have any idea? You have medicine classes, right? No? Which hormone is increased in hyperparathyroidism? Bolo? Parathormone, yeah. So what is the function of parathormone? Calcium? Yeah. Calcitonin? Calcitonin? Calcium regulation, yeah, okay. How does it regulate calcium? Bone? Is it bone resorption, or does it, like parathormone increases the bone deposition inside the bone, like it increases skeletal mass. Calcitonin does the opposite. Now the second type of bone is the lamellar bone. As we said, primary bone is the woven bone. So this is the disorganized mass of bones. And then we have lamellar bone, which is the organized mass of bones. Now when the woven bone is organized and it's oriented along the lines of stress and it is remodeled, it's called a lamellar bone. Now, as you would expect, the time taken to form lamellar bone would be much higher since it is an organized bone. It is basically a woven bone which is compressed into sheets, like thin sheets. But whenever the woven bone is compressed together, it forms the lamellar bone. That's what lamella means. Means like layers, sheets. As I said, when woven bone is a disorganized mass. A lamellar bone is a much more organized. It is microscopically much more organized compared to a woven bone. Now, the linear apposition rate, which is apposition rate means the growth rate, basically length, growth rate in which the length is increased. So it amounts to only 1 to 2 microns per day. Now, even in lamellar bone, there are two types of lamellar bone that we can see macroscopically. Macroscopically is something that we can see with our eyes. Like whenever you see a bone, you can see. Whenever you see a bone in front of you, you can see two types of bone. So first there is compact bone and there is spongy bone. Like you have seen bones in anatomy classes. Compact bone or the cortical bone is a shell-like structure at the surface of the bone which gives shape and biomechanical strength. Now in the shaft, compact bone, the thickness can be up to 1 centimeters. Have you had anatomy classes in bone? You have had classes, right? Anatomy class for bone. What are the parts of a bone, of a typical long bone? Yeah, okay, yeah, exactly. So the shaft, the middle part, the longest part that you can see, that's called the diaphysis. On the two ends, you can see the metaphysis, and the part which basically forms the joints or the ends, absolute ends of the bone, that is the epiphysis. We talk about a cortical bone, the part that you see in the middle, the diaphysis that forms the compact bone or the cortical bone. So in large bones like the femur, that's the thickest part of the cortex can be very thick. It can be up to 1 centimeters. Now, the specialized structure which is provided by osteons of the Haversian system. Now, you have studied in histology the microscopic parts of a osteon, the Haversian system, the Volkmann's canals. The Haversian system is the cylindrical structure which is oriented parallel to the long axis of the bone. What does that mean? Oriented parallel to the long axis of the bone. Suppose this is the femur, which is the long axis of the femur. This part is the long axis of the femur. So Haversian system is basically the part, the canal. It's a canal basically, which is oriented parallel to the long axis. So it basically grows proximally to distally. That's what the Haversian system is. Now it's a cylindrical structure. The concentric layers of the lamellae with the central canal, which is called the Haversian canal. The Haversian canal is lined by endosteum and is filled with a neurovascular bundle. Now the other part is a Volkmann's canal, which is basically perpendicular to the Haversian system. So it penetrates the bone inside. So it is oriented perpendicular to the Haversian system. So it is horizontal to the long axis of the bone. As you can see here, like this is the Haversian system. This is the part which I said which is oriented to the long axis of the bone. As you can see here, this is the one which is going down vertically. These are the osteocytes. The osteocytes are the units of the bone, the basic units of the bone. What is the periosteum? Yeah, it's the outermost layer of the bone. It's a thin fibrous tissue which covers the bone. What is the any idea about what is the function of the periosteum? Exactly. Yes, it gives the blood supply to the bone. As such, if you see a bone, you would think that it's entirely mineralized. Like it just seems like it's a very hard mineralized calcific structure, but it's not that exactly, because it needs blood supply all the time. And you have seen the medullary cavity of a bone usually. The medullary cavity of a bone, the central canal of a bone. Like even if you haven't seen in anatomy, you'd have seen it. Like if you like eat chicken or mutton, anything, the innermost part of the bone that contains the blood. Now, the periosteum forms the outermost layer of the bone, which supplies blood to the inner parts of the bone. Now, the periosteum is very important, especially if you see on later on the clinical importance of the periosteum is very important, because if the periosteum is hampered, especially during a surgery, an orthopedic surgery, if you strip the periosteum, the bone, the blood supply to the bone is lost. So, as a like just as a like clinical side note, this is not important to you as such. So, whenever we do a surgery, you have to remember not to like damage the periosteum as much as possible, because if you damage the periosteum, you are damaging the blood supply to the bone. Now, the other type of bone is the spongy bone, which is the cancellous bone. It's a porous structure. The layers of the lamellar bone forms the trabeculae. This part is the trabeculae, the mesh-like structure that you can see going downwards, the part of the cancellous bone. This is the trabeculae. Now, it is usually oriented parallel to the axis of the highest compression and tension forces. What does that mean? When we say that it is oriented like axis of the highest compression, like suppose you are standing, your entire weight of the body is carried by your legs. So let's say for example the femur carries a big part of your body weight. So when we say the forces, which is the axis of highest compression, what does that mean? Your body weight travels from, like, to put very simply, travels proximally to distally. So when you are standing straight, the body weight is passing through the femur. So it goes from the proximal part to the distal part. So when we say that it is oriented parallel to the axis of highest compression, when you say it's oriented parallel to the axis of highest compression, it means like the cancellous bone is oriented proximally and distally. Like it is present proximally and distally, it is absent in the middle. In the diaphysis, it is not there. Now, the cavity between the trabeculae is filled by bone marrow and the blood vessels. What is the purpose of this blood vessels? The bone marrow. What purpose does the bone marrow serve in the body? Hematopoiesis? Hematopoiesis, yeah, exactly. The structure and function of the bone cell. These are basically parts of embryology, the basic structures of the bone cell. The first is the osteoprogenitor cell, which is derived from the mesenchymal stem cell, and it forms the precursor cell for the osteoblast. It is found in the endosteum and the cambium layer of the periosteum. Even you will see later on that the periosteum has several layers that are named layers. That's not that important right now, but the most active layer, which has the most blood supply and forms the most number of osteoblasts, is the cambium layer. Next, coming to the osteoblast. Osteoblast is the primary bone cell, primary stem cell of the bone. So it is cuboidal in shape and is the only cell which produces the organic component or the osteocytes. It induces the formation of the inorganic component of the ECM. It induces the formation, so it does not form the mineralized part itself, but it induces the deposition of the hydroxyapatite crystals. It controls the formation and the activity of the osteoclasts. We'll see later on what an osteoclast is. Do you have any idea what is an osteoclast is? Bone? Yes, it destroys the bone. Basically, it's the cell which is responsible for bone resorption. Yeah. Osteoblastic activity. We see how the osteoblastic activity is being regulated here. The osteoblast produces the organic matrix, and it leads to the 3D arrangement of the collagen fibers that we saw right a few slides ago. The organic part is formed by the collagen fibers. Which type of collagen fibers? Type 1, yes. It's very important because bone consists of type 1 collagen fibers. And where do you see type 2 collagen fibers? Hmm? In tendon, yeah, tendons, ligaments, most commonly, yeah, and also in cartilage, yes. Osteoblast releases the matrix vesicle, which is rich in calcium binding proteins. Calcium binding proteins, which are annexin and phosphatidylserine. Annexin is the most important part in this, like more significant contribution in this. Now, this leads to the deposition of calcium and phosphate within the vesicle, and it together forms the hydroxyapatite crystal. Hydroxyapatite is, as I said, it's basically a crystal of calcium phosphate. Now, osteoblastic modification is when the osteoblast secretes the osteoid, they forms the cellular processes. Like these are the cellular processes of the osteocytes. Now, each osteocyte is connected with each other with a gap junction, and this is responsible for nutrition supply and signal transmission. This is the microscopic structure of an osteocyte. Osteocytes are the basic functional units of the bone. It is present throughout the bone and is important for tissue maintenance. Now, this is the soma, the osteocyte soma, the cell body of the osteocyte, and the gap surrounding the soma is called the lacunae. And this is the canaliculi, this is the gap surrounding the processes. Like these are the processes of the osteocyte, and the gaps that you can see around this thin white parts, these are the canaliculi. Now, the function of the osteocyte is it's a sensor of mechanical changes in the microenvironment. We'll see this is important later on because the osteocyte induces formation of new bones. So, how does it form new bones? Because it can detect mechanical stresses in the microscopic structures. What do you mean by mechanical stresses? Suppose there's a fracture. When does a fracture happen in a bone? When the bone is being stretched or compressed beyond its mechanical limits. So, then it leads to a fracture. So an osteocyte can detect that. It can detect like even suppose there isn't a fracture and there is just what we can in layman's term what we call a hairline fracture. Suppose there is a hairline fracture, the osteocyte can detect changes in its mechanical and changes in its environment, the cellular environment, and it induces formation of further osteocytes, which leads to formation of fibroblasts. We can like that's how the inflammatory cascade. Now coming to the osteoclast, which is the other kind of cell along with an osteocyte. It's a multinucleated bone marrow derived cell. It's the only cell which is able to degrade and resorb mineralized bone tissue. So now we are coming to the resorption of the bone tissue, the mineralized component. It is vital for remodeling and calcium metabolism, and the formation is primarily controlled by an osteoblast. The interaction of a monocyte with an osteoblast leads to osteoclastogenesis. What is a monocyte? Yeah, what is the monocyte responsible for? Yes, exactly. Yeah, in an inflammatory cascade or in an injury reaction, the monocyte is responsible mainly for phagocytosis. It not only performs phagocytosis itself, but it also induces phagocytosis in other cells. So similarly, when a monocyte interacts with an osteoblast, it leads to osteoclastogenesis, which is basically formation of an osteoclast. Now, osteoblast is the actual target cell for most hormones. We'll see this later on. Now, let's take a look at the osteoclastic activity. This is an osteoclast that we see here, and this part is the bone matrix. You can see the diagram at the end. This is the bone matrix, and this part is the osteoclast. So, we are taking a look at how osteoclastogenesis or like how osteoclastic activity works, how the bone is resolved. Now, the osteoclast is attached to the mineralized bone matrix, and it forms a tight annular seal. This part. And this part is known as the resorption lacunae. The part between the bone and the osteoclast itself is called the resorption lacunae, also known as the house-shaped lacunae. Now, osteoclast secretes hydrochloric acid and lysosomal matrix degrading enzymes. One example is a cathepsin K. Now, this HCl dissolves the hydroxyapatite crystals. So, it leads to uncovering of the organic part of the ECM, which is cleaved by specialized enzymes. Okay. So, how does the osteoclast work on a bone? It attaches to the bone matrix and it releases hydrochloric acid, which leads to degradation of the mineralized bone matrix. Now, coming to osteoblast and osteoclast interaction, osteoclastic activity is mediated by osteoblasts, which has receptors for more relevant hormones in bone remodeling, parathormone and calcitriol. So, parathormone and calcitriol, they all act on the osteoblasts. The formation of the production of the osteoblast depends on two substances, the MCSF. So, the monocyte, as I mentioned a few moments ago, the monocyte has receptors for the MCSF and the rank. The rank is a receptor activator for nuclear factor kappa B. Now, this is important later on. Like, have you studied in pharmacology how rank L is important? Yeah. Which drug acts on? Huh? Yeah, then so exactly. So, when the monocyte interacts with the osteoblast, it leads to formation of the osteoclast. So, this is the osteoclastic activity that we see here. Now, in embryos, the skeleton is primarily hyaline cartilage, and this cartilage is replaced by bone. Now, we are coming to the part where about bone formation, primary bone formation. Ossification is the process of bone formation. It has two major phases. The first phase is where the hyaline cartilage model is covered by bone matrix. It's called with bone matrix, and then the enclosed hyaline cartilage is completely digested away and forms new bone. Now, coming to the types of ossification, there are two types of ossification that we'll see here. The first is the intramembranous ossification, or where the bone tissue is created on the surface of the bone, how it is created. The bone tissue is created directly over the mesenchymal tissue, and this is how the healing of a fracture occurs, and in the initial formation of flat bones. Which are the flat bones? An example, the skull bones are flat bones, the mandible, maxilla, and the clavicle is the only long bone which has intramembranous ossification. Now, the steps are the mesenchymal stem cell, which is seen within the medullary cavity of the bone. It initiates the ossification process. It begins to replicate and forms a nidus. Then the mesenchymal cell within it stops replicating. After the formation of the nidus, the mesenchymal cell stops replicating, and there are morphological changes within the mesenchymal cell which induces formation of the osteoprogenitor cells. Now, this part is where we see the mesenchymal cells. In this, the mesenchymal cell, the cell body becomes larger and rounder. These are the histological changes which take place in intramembranous ossification, and then the cell processes within it vanish, and the Golgi apparatus and the large the number increases. The osteoprogenitor cell forms the osteoblast. The osteoblast creates the extracellular matrix osteoid, which contains the type 1 collagen, which entraps the osteoblast. So, what is happening here? Basically, the osteoblast creates the extracellular matrix and it traps the osteocyte in it, traps the osteoblast in it. So, basically, the osteoblast creates the ECM around it, and when the osteoblast is completely surrounded by its own extracellular matrix, it stops replicating. Now, when it stops replicating, that's when mineralization occurs and the bone tissue is formed. So, further, the secretion of osteoid increases the size of the spicules, which fuses together and forms the trabeculae. That is what we see macroscopically. Now, with continuous growth, the trabeculae becomes interconnected and forms the woven bone. And the woven bone, as we saw previously, the woven bone, it compresses together to form the lamellar bone, which is arranged in sheets. And when the growth is more or less complete, the periosteum is formed subsequently. And now this is the important part in the periosteum. When the osteogenic cells which are originated from the periosteum, it increases the appositional growth. What do we mean by appositional growth? Yeah, exactly. When it increases the thickness of the bone. So that is responsible for the horizontal growth, not the vertical growth. Now, the other kind of ossification is endochondral ossification, which is basically, what does endochondral mean? It very simply means within cartilage. Yeah. So the cartilage, we have to remember that the cartilage does not convert to a bone; it is merely replaced by the bone. Now the mesenchymal cell, it differentiates into the chondroblasts, which forms the hyaline cartilage model. This is the kind of ossification that we see in an embryo, in the embryological stages and the early stages of growth. So the chondroblast, which forms the hyaline cartilage model, and subsequently the perichondrium is formed. What is the perichondrium? Hmm? What is the periosteum is the covering of the bone. A perichondrium is the covering of the cartilage. Yeah. Now more matrix is produced, and the chondrocytes in the center of the cartilage model grows in size. Now this is a common theme that we see both in endochondral ossification and in the intramembranous ossification. Whenever a chondroblast or an osteoblast, it increases in size, it eventually gets trapped in its own extracellular matrix, and this leads to mineralization. Now, similarly in chondrocytes, when the matrix calcifies and the nutrients cannot reach the chondrocytes anymore, it results in death of the chondrocytes and in degeneration of the surrounding cartilage. Now, the resulting space is eventually invaded by the blood vessels, and it forms the medullary cavity that we can see macroscopically. The cartilage grows and the capillary is penetrated. This penetration initiates the transformation of the perichondrium to the periosteum. Osteoblast forms the periosteal collar around the cartilage of the diaphysis. This part is not that important right now. Yes. By the second and third month of the fetal life, the bone cell development and the ossification ramps up and creates the primary ossification center, which is a region deep to the periosteal collar where ossification begins. What does this mean? The primary ossification center is basically the part of the bone or the developing bone where the ossification begins. Now we'll see on later on that there are two types of ossification centers: the primary ossification center and the secondary ossification center. You might have encountered this in forensic medicine, like where you can see with X-rays, you can determine the age of the bone, basically. Now this schema shows the endochondral ossification. This is the hyaline cartilage that we see here. These are the chondroblasts that you can see. It gradually degenerates and develops the periosteum at the sides. Now, what we discussed right now, that eventually this becomes too thick so that the smaller blood vessels, it cannot penetrate into the innermost parts of the perichondrium. Now, this is the stage where the cartilage starts to calcify, and the bigger blood vessels can then penetrate inside into the bony part, and this part is then called the primary ossification center, where the growth of the bone begins. Now eventually the thickness and the length of these blood vessels, it increases and it forms the medullary cavity here, and gradually we can see that this is the spongy bone that you can see here. This implies that this is a spongy bone, and gradually this spongy bone is being compressed to the sides and it forms the compact bone at the side that you can see here. So this entire part then forms the diaphysis, which is this part, then metaphysis. Yeah, exactly. So basically, the growth the primary ossification, it begins from the diaphyseal part and it spreads towards the metaphysis, and gradually only the part of the metaphysis remains, which is filled by the spongy bone. Now the bone replaces the cartilage except at the articular part, where the articular cartilage is here, and the epiphyseal plates that we can see here. Which is what does the epiphyseal plate mean? What does it do? An epiphyseal, huh? Yeah, exactly. Epiphyseal plate is responsible for, like, basically an epiphyseal plate is the part where their bone is not there. It is like there's only cartilage, so that it allows for length, growth in length of the bone. So this is something that we would see in a newborn or a baby whose growth is like his growth part is left. So what happens if like think of a pathological condition in which the epiphyseal part like it has died or it has fused early? What would that lead to? Yeah, exactly. It will lead to dwarfs. You'll see this later on when we are going to touch on the orthopedic diseases. This is the same thing. Now a short note on like the secondary ossification center. So right now what we saw was the primary ossification center here. So by the second and third month of the fetal life, the bone cell development and the ossification, it increases. So it forms the primary ossification center that we saw here right now. Now, what would happen if ossification, like there was no secondary ossification center? So the primary ossification center is found in the fetal life. So this is completed by the time a baby is born or within the first few months of neonate's life. So what we see here is the secondary ossification center. This part here is the secondary ossification center. So by the time the fetal skull is fully formed, the cartilage remains only in the joint surface as an articular cartilage, and between the diaphysis and the epiphysis as a physeal plate, which is responsible for longitudinal growth of the bone. Okay, so the epiphysis, between what is present between the diaphysis and the epiphysis, the physeal plate. How do you see a physeal plate in an X-ray? How does an X-ray? I don't have a picture of an X-ray here right now, but like you have seen in a child's X-ray, like there's a bone, and between, if you see a radius, for example, there will be a bone, and after that there will be a black part, a black space, and then another thin layer of bone. So what is that black space? That space is the physeal plate. So why can we not see that on an X-ray? Because it is a cartilage. Like I said, like physeal plate is a cartilage. So the cartilage does not have any minerals in it. So it is radio opaque. It's radiolucent. After birth, this same sequence of events occurs in the epiphyseal region. This is called the secondary center of ossification. So the events that we saw here, this same event occurs after birth here in the secondary ossification center, which is responsible for growth of the child. This was an overview on the anatomy and physiology of the bones. So what are the important parts that we saw here? What is the function of the bone? It forms the structure of the body. It is involved in hematopoiesis, okay, and forms joints, which is responsible for movement. So microscopically, if we see a bone tissue, we can divide it into a microscopic part and a macroscopic part. The microscopic parts are the primary bone or the woven bone, which is a disorganized mass of bone, which is compressed together to form the lamellar bone. Lamellar bone is the bone which is arranged in sheets. Now, this same event that we see here, this is seen in embryological and during growth. The same sequence of event occurs whenever there is a fracture and there is new bone formation. So, initially, if you see X-ray of a fracture, you will see that even after reduction, suppose we have done any surgery or suppose there is no surgery, initially we will see a very thin disorganized mass of tissue which forms around the fracture. This is called as the callus. So the same thing. This is the callus is basically the woven bone, initial parts of the woven bone. And if you take serial X-rays of a fracture, you'll see eventually that callus is reabsorbed together, and it forms the bone which was seen previously before the fracture. These are the diseases that we can see woven bone. Like without a fracture, these diseases are important in the cases where we can see woven bone again. Yes, and macroscopically, what are the two types of bone tissue? The cortical bone and the spongy bone. The cortical bone is the part of the bone which we see in the diaphysis, and in the metaphysis and the epiphyseal areas, we see the woven bone. Which are what is the osteocyte? Osteocyte is the functional unit of a bone, and it is present. The gap which is surrounding the osteocyte soma is called the lacunae, and the parts which surrounds the processes are called the canaliculi. Anyways, and this part is important, the osteoclastic activity. This shows how an osteoclast is working inside the body. The osteoclast surrounds the bone matrix. The part between the bone matrix and the osteoclast is called the resorption lacunae. It secretes, the osteoclast secretes hydrochloric acid, which dissolves the matrix, bone matrix. It shows how an osteoclast induction is induction of an osteoclast is done. It is done with the help of a monocyte and an osteoblast. The osteoblast carries the rank ligand, and the monocyte carries the rank receptor, and together they form the mature osteoclasts. What are the two types of ossification that we see? First is the intramembranous ossification, which is responsible for ossification at the surface of the bones, and the other type is the endochondral ossification, which is responsible for conversion of the cartilage to the bone. In endochondral ossification, we see the primary ossification center here, which is responsible for initial growth during the fetal life and following birth of the baby. And in the initial years, we see the formation of the secondary ossification center, which leads to ultimate growth of the bones, longitudinal growth of the bones.